Hello everyone, I'm Mike Ward and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG and Clarivate. This episode is one of a number that we're recording alongside On Helix, a digital conference that has been hosted by One Nucleus. In line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by Eric Elenko, who's going to offer insights from a different perspective from some of the other calls that we've had. Eric is the Chief Innovation Officer of PureTech, a clinical stage biotech with a broad and deep pipeline that's developed both either internally or through founded entities. PureTech is headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. It's listed on the London Stock Exchange and has a market capitalization of approximately £700 million. So Eric, thank you for joining me. I hope you and those you care about are keeping safe and well. And as I say, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
So great. So as I mentioned in my introduction, PureTech it's an interesting business model that involves having its own internal programs as well as developing others through, as you describe them, founded entities. Could you explain why you have chosen this two-pronged approach?
Yeah, historically, and this is when we first started PureTech, what we would do is we would start with a problem. It would be an unmet need, and then proactively look around the world for a potential solution to that problem. And then we would go and bring the relevant technology and intellectual property into a new company, which we would form, manage ourselves initially, and fund ourselves. And these are what we call our founded entities. And then as these would mature, we would bring in outside capital from other financial investors or strategic partners, as well as dedicated management teams, and they would become increasingly independent. Now, a shift for us more recently is we've also started an internal pipeline. So these are programs which are entirely owned by ourselves, meaning while we might do partnerships with larger companies involving non-dilutive funding, we're not taking any dilutive funding. They're 100% owned by us. In contrast to the founded entities, where those will have outside capital coming in. And by having our own internal pipeline, it allows us to capture more of the upside of those programs. And it also allows us to achieve synergies because that pipeline is really focused largely on the lymphatic system and the immune space.
Right. So, so this asset-centric approach, which the people are taking, how do you choose? How do you decide which ones are going to be earmarked for founded entities, and how do you earmark those that are actually going to be something that you are going to pursue yourselves?
Yeah, so the model for both in terms of how we identify those assets and the programs and the starting points for solving a problem are the same in that starting with an unmet need, proactively looking for a solution, really having an insight to that solution that others don't have. Right now, the default for our programs actually is to keep them internally, knowing that we always have the optionality to pursue other paths with them. And the focus of the internal pipeline is around lymphatics and the immune system. And so it's a little bit more focused in that sense. And more generally, we've been involved in the brain, the immune system, and the gut, representing the greater GI system or brain immune gut. That includes both the treatment of pathologies for those three systems as well as the intersection of those three systems in terms of disease.
Okay, so we'll come on to that BIG axis, but with the founded entities, these affiliates that you have, how involved is PureTech once you have parked an asset in one of these entities?
Yeah, with the founded entities, these are all companies we created ourselves. And this is really an important distinction that you're raising, as we're not investors. We were never a venture capital firm. These were all created entirely from scratch by PureTech using this problem-centric approach. And then initially, we actually would run these founded entities ourselves. And so be quite involved. And then really one of the keys for us was trying to go and say, what is it that would make us really believe, or what would make us want to say, no, this isn't a good idea, and try to do those experiments as quickly as possible. And then as these companies would go and mature, at that point, we would bring in outside management, outside capital. And over time, we'll become less involved. So our involvement will reflect the degree of maturity of the company. For instance, in the case of a more advanced public company, we may not even be on the board, versus a company really early on in its life cycle will be heavily involved in that company.
Okay, so you start off where you almost like own everything, and as you progress, you bring in other investors, or you bring in investors, and you're sort of diluting your own holding in the business. So could you sort of just give us an example of, say, for example, one of these founded entities, what its evolution looked like?
Absolutely. So an example would be Kalina Therapeutics. And there we were very interested in schizophrenia. That's a devastating disease, affects, you can go anywhere in the world and you'll see anywhere estimates of 0.5% to as much as 1% of the population, really huge impact on patients. And if you look at currently used drugs, antipsychotics, they all have the same basic pharmacological mechanism of action. And we saw this as an area of great unmet need. And what we did is we got together leading experts, brainstormed, and said, if we could do anything in this space, what would it be? What has the greatest promise? And that led us to identify the particular part of the brain called muscarinic receptors, and in particular a drug that had been developed by Eli Lilly called xanomeline, which looked quite promising. And in the case of xanomeline, it had encountered some tolerability issues. And what PureTech did is, knowing that this was a good approach and there was just tremendous excitement around it, came up with an idea for how to overcome those tolerability issues, which was to pair it with another drug. Xanomeline had never been developed, but we had the idea of pairing it with what was an improved drug, and then to take that forward and calling that our CAR-XT. And then drove that forward through proof of concept trial on healthy volunteers, showing the increase in tolerability. And additional outside investors came into that. That ended up doing an IPO, had a phase 2 readout that looks quite promising. And this is very exciting because what we're looking at is really a truly new approach to this devastating disease, where there's been such a lack of progress in decades. So it's an example where we started with a problem, identified a potential solution. In the case of xanomeline, we went and proactively went and licensed that. Lilly wasn't looking to out-license it. We went and licensed that, brought it in, created new intellectual property, and then drove it forward. And so I think that shows both how something can mature from literally starting from an idea on paper to a public company with phase 2 data, and would only exist because we started with a problem rather than just starting with the raw technology.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You describe your approach as a problem-centric approach, where you identify the unmet medical need. Your job title is Chief Innovation Officer, and there is clearly a journey from having one, identify the problem, then having sort of an inventive step or a discovery, to actually translating that into an innovation. Can you sort of tell us how you go about sort of that particular transformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really break it down into 2 parts. So whenever we're looking at a potential solution to a problem, the first thing we do, we look at, and when we do on these exercises, we go through a lot. But for the things that rise to the top that look promising, and including for even areas where we might identify a potential solution, and then we're actually inventors and have our own intellectual property contribution. What first thing we'll say is, what are we most skeptical of? Why do we think this won't work? What experiment could we do that'll actually kill this? And really the goal is to say, how do we, in the shortest amount of time with the smallest amount of money, de-risk something, and particularly the points where we're most skeptical? And then once we do that, then we can feel comfortable to make larger capital expenditures to move something forward. When we do move something forward and do go look at translation, it's very case by case in terms of the best way to move it forward. Sometimes that will require work in our own laboratories. We do in fact have our own laboratories. A lot of times this will be outsourced through contract research, or will require some type of clinical trial. But in each case, the approach really is saying, we're at point A. In terms of development path, what's point B that'll really add value and further de-risk that asset, and what's the most efficient path to make that happen, whether it's through physical research or a more virtual outsourced approach.
Yeah. So when you're sort of looking to source these inventions or these discoveries, what does that process look like? I mean, are you looking in academic labs? Is it research papers you're looking at? Is it patents that people may have already filed?
Yeah, so what we found is when we take this problem-centric approach, and that problem can be, how do we solve a particular disease or come up with a new therapeutic for a particular disease where there's been a lack of innovation? There's an area of great emerging science. We have found that the first step in that process tends to be getting together an interdisciplinary group of experts and really brainstorming with them. And so there is an element of more traditional search in terms of looking at the literature, looking what's out there. But what we found is, if you get the right group of people around the table and you get them brainstorming, it's the experts who really understand not only what exists in the field, but also perhaps what hasn't been published yet. They'll be able to identify, hey, here are the rising stars, go talk to them. And from those brainstorming sessions, from those discussions, really we get boundaries for a solution set to define what we're looking for. And then we'll proactively go around the world looking. A lot of times that does come from academic labs, or the insights come from academic labs. But then other times we've taken things from industry, so Kalina being an example. More recently in our internal pipeline, our LYT 100 program, our deuterate pirfenidone program. That was a combination where we had insight from academia, and then we also knew about a compound and put two and two together and ended up acquiring that compound. So it's more about what's the best solution, and that can come from academia, it can come from industry, it can be a combination.
Right. I mean, one of the interesting things about PureTech is that you've got, a pretty impressive board and R&D committee. I mean, it's got, former Sanofi CEO Christopher Viehbacher. It's got John Lamartina, who headed up research at Pfizer. The MIT, Bob Langer, who's probably, arguably one of the most creative or productive academic scientists when it comes to sort of the medical field. And of course, Rob Horvitz, who's a Nobel Prize winner. I mean, it's an impressive list. Are these the kind of people that you have in your brainstorming sessions? I mean, I just wonder how active they are in your process.
Yeah, they're definitely very active. And really on a couple of different levels. And you're right, it's an amazing group that really covers off a number of areas of drug development, from research to development on the clinical side to the commercial side. And having all of those perspectives are just incredibly valuable. And having those voices in the room are amazingly helpful. And their involvement spans from everything from participating in these brainstormings, being on the boards of our founded entities, but perhaps most importantly, at a board level, being involved in the PureTech strategy, and also being heavily involved in green lighting any decisions about, let's go into this area, let's go forward with this program, let's really take something seriously. And their perspective and experience is something really that there's, you never have a substitute for experience, I think, when it comes to drug development and commercialization. And we take it very seriously, and they're very involved.
Right. So you mentioned, right, okay, so it's a problem-centric approach. You identify an unmet medical need. You're then looking for potential solutions. Does that mean that the world's your oyster, or is there a sweet spot that you're looking for, whether it's either something that you sort of develop yourselves or through one of your founded entities?
Yeah, so with regards to geography, we're really agnostic. We've really been involved in taking in technologies from all around the world, all over the US, Europe, Australia, Japan. So it really comes down to what's the best solution for the problem. And is that solution something, to your earlier question, which is a really important one, can we drive it forward in a meaningful, actionable way that will actually produce something that's going to get into the hands of patients and help patients? And in terms of areas of focus, we do have this brain immune gut focus historically. We're particularly interested right now in the lymphatic system, which we think is an area of great potential in terms of both harnessing the lymphatic system in the context of creating therapeutics, as well as treating dysfunction of the lymphatic system where there's just been a lack of innovation. So we definitely have a focus, and we tend to drill down very deep when we go and undertake one of these problem-solving exercises.
Yeah. So you mentioned about the BIG axis, this brain immune gut axis. For the past 10 years, we've seen a sort of a massive upsurge in the number of publications around sort of the microbiome, etc. I'm just wondering, how long is it going to take for that academic, that scientific surge to actually be translated into products that are going to be transformative for patients?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. What you've seen over the last several years is tremendous interest in the microbiome, the potential of the microbiome coming out of academia, insights in terms of how the microbiome can be tied to both normal physiology as well as dysfunction and disease when, for instance, microbes are missing that should be there. And I think right now we are seeing this important transition of going from academic insight to creation of actual drugs. So one of our founded entities is called Vedanta. Vedanta is, we would argue, the leading company in the microbiome space. Actually has drug candidates that are in the clinic. These represent defined consortium of live biological therapeutics, which are rationally designed and selected in a very deliberate manner. And these are starting to undergo clinical testing right now. And there are a number of different indications, reoccurring C. difficile, use in oncology in the context of immuno-oncology, food allergy. So we're really at the point where the academic science is now starting to be translated into making of actual drug candidates. And the key, of course, is going to be how those candidates go and read out in the clinic. So as we get increasing momentum and positive data, which is what we hope for, of course, one has to do the clinical experiment, that's going to end up likely driving a lot of the microbiome field now is success and empirical evidence in the clinic. And that really then will start to unleash, I think, the potential of the whole microbiome field. So we're really at the point where those clinical trials are starting and will be reading out in the not too distant future.
So thinking about your business model, where you've identified a problem, you're working on some solutions, etc. Is there scope? If I was a sort of an academic running a lab and thinking you may have overlooked my approach, is there some scope for people to almost like pitch to PureTech, sort of saying, actually, this is something you might be interested in because it fits in with the focus of one of the programs that you're running or you're associated with?
Yeah, we're always happy to have conversations with people and have discussions. Our programs were really started using this proactive approach, where what we found is we've been able to identify the most exciting programs in innovation by proactively reaching out to people in the context of trying to solve a problem. But of course, we're always happy to hear about innovative science, to speak with people. But we're not a venture capital firm. We're not investing in third-party companies. But we're, of course, always very happy to engage in scientific dialogue and then in areas of interest to see if something might be a fit.
Sure. So you mentioned LYT 100, which is your most advanced internal program. This is that deuterated form of pirfenidone.
Yeah.
Recently, and you have decided to sort of look at that as a potential treatment for sort of respiratory complications that have been associated with or known to affect patients who actually have recovered from COVID-19. And you were obviously developing it for other areas initially. Could you sort of describe or outline the process that happened to make that decision, sort of saying, well, actually, there may be some potential here in COVID-19 as well?
Yeah, it really centered around this problem-based approach where what we saw in COVID-19 and is emerging from the literature is the issue of pulmonary complications, both more acutely, and then there's emerging evidence that even when someone goes past a post-acute phase, that they are at risk for having respiratory issues. And those respiratory issues can reflect inflammation and also the potential for fibrosis. And knowing that unmet need existed, and then knowing how our drug LYT-100 works, and putting those two together, again, speaking with experts in the field, of course, digging into the data, we really start to see a match and the potential to potentially help patients during what is a global health crisis. And, again, it's that putting together, here's what's needed. Here's also an area that if you look at COVID-19, what's been impressive is the response to it in terms of a tremendous amount of people trying to help, which is fantastic. But really that help has really been focused or is being tested in things like vaccines, antivirals, acute anti-inflammatories that might help patients who are particularly severe. And there's been much less attention focused on how do we intervene to help patients as they're coming out of this post-acute phase and are recovering, to make sure that they're able to function and really to either help prevent or to help improve the pulmonary dysfunction that might follow. So unmet need, and knowing that we might have a way of solving that for patients.
So when you make a decision like that, where you sort of say, right, okay, so LYT-100 has potential in COVID-19, and therefore you're going to start running a program there. Does that mean that something else has had to be put on the back burner? What's happening there?
We actually have not had to put anything on the back burner or make any adjustments in terms of guiding towards cash or budget. We had previously planned for and announced that in addition to lymphedema, which you're absolutely right in terms of our initial focus in terms of development of LYT-100 was a condition called lymphedema, which affects a lot of people, about 1 million people conservatively in the United States. And really, there's no approved pharmacological agent to treat that. We had also said that we planned on conducting at least one more program for LYT-100 this year. So the COVID-19 program slotted very nicely in terms of being another program that we could go and explore with the drug.
The social distancing, lockdown, which has been associated with COVID-19, has impacted a lot of companies. They've had to sort of change the way that they do the business, or they've had to slow things down, or even postpone clinical trials. How has the pandemic affected sort of the day-to-day business at PureTech?
We haven't seen any material changes. And we've been fortunate in terms of clinical trial progress. And it's been really amazing, actually, the ability to utilize technology, right? We're using Zoom now, and it's been amazing. People have just embraced it or using it. And so we actually haven't seen any material impact for us.
Right. So as a sort of a final question, you mentioned just a little while ago the sort of the rapid and incredible response that the industry has had towards COVID-19. I just wonder, which sort of innovative responses have most impressed you to date?
No, I would say it's more the overall response by scientists, by industry, the fact that people are just willing to dive in, to prioritize this, to cooperate. Really, it's been an unprecedented response around the world, and it's wonderful to see, and definitely hope that multiple programs succeed. Of course, they're not going to all succeed, but we're all hoping that they'll be met with success. And I think that's the spirit you see in people working on COVID-19, is just this incredible desire to help patients, and really people recognizing the impact that this disease is having on the lives of individuals and society.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, the sort of the response and the way that companies are getting together to collaborate. There is a possibility that post-pandemic, this kind of new set of behaviours, may become sort of a more regular occurrence. It might actually become part of the industry, which is potentially useful for everyone.
Absolutely. And I think that's, when I talk to people in the field, that really is the attitude, is what can we do to make things better? I think to your point, which is right, that there will be certain areas that where you could see some change coming out of the pandemic. One area I would flag is use of telemedicine and also digital technologies, which is an area of interest for PureTech historically. But as people have had to socially distance, there's been a willingness to embrace on the medical front telehealth, and then also alternative ways of assessing health. And I imagine as the pandemic recedes, that people, having seen the value of those tools, will continue to embrace them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, some of the research that we've done here at DRG totally confirms that, both in terms of the behaviors that we've seen, but also the acceptance both on patients and on physicians to actually embrace this new approach for interaction between patient and doctor. So,
yeah,
Eric,
that's right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. The insights that you provided there are going to be of great interest to the audience.
Thank you for the conversation, all the great questions. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so cheers. So if you'd like to tune in to future conversations, follow our LinkedIn page, where we'll be posting alerts to the future episodes. So in closing, I'd like to thank Eric again for joining us, and also thank all our listeners for tuning in. So until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.